It started out as just a normal weekend, or at least that's what I thought as I tossed my bag into the backseat of my car and pulled out of the driveway. The plan was simple. Spend the weekend at Uncle John's place, like I often did when life got a little too loud. John wasn't just anyone to me. He was this fascinating older guy who seemed to move through the world with a kind of grace I couldn't help but admire. At 35, he carried a calm confidence that came across effortlessly, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. It wasn't just his age or his charisma that drew me to him. It was the way he made me feel seen, as though every word I said mattered. That kind of attention was rare, and I'd grown to crave it. The drive to his house wasn't long, just enough time for my mind to wander. The week had been hectic, and I'd been looking forward to this moment all day. As I turned onto his quiet street, lined with neat rows of trees and homes that felt lived in but not overly polished, I felt a familiar flutter of excitement. His home was a reflection of him. Cozy but intentional, with every detail telling a story. The moment I stepped through the door, I caught the faint aroma of coffee mingling with the subtle notes of the cologne he always wore. "You made it," John said, greeting me at the door with a warm, welcoming voice. He pulled me into a hug, and that sense of ease washed over me again, the kind I could never quite find with anyone my own age. We exchanged a few words about the drive and the usual pleasantries, but even small talk felt different with him. There was an energy between us, something unspoken but undeniably present. After settling in, we decided to go for a walk. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. The park near his house was one of my favorite places. The trees stood tall and proud, their leaves whispering gently in the crisp evening breeze. We walked side by side, our conversation flowing effortlessly. That was one of the things I loved most about spending time with John. How natural everything felt. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time. He'd share stories from his travels, and I'd tell him about the books I was reading or the dreams I was chasing. With him, there was no need to filter myself. "You know," he said, stopping to look at me with that familiar spark in his eyes, "sometimes I think these little walks are the best part of the day. Just being here talking with you." I smiled, feeling my cheeks flush slightly. "It's the simple things, right?" "Exactly," he replied, his tone soft but deliberate. There was something about the way he said it that made me wonder if he meant more than just the walk, but I didn't press. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know, not yet anyway. After a while, we wandered over to a small row of shops near the park. We didn't need anything, but there was something comforting about browsing together. We ducked into a bookstore, and I watched as John's fingers skimmed over the spines of novels, occasionally pulling one out to inspect it. I picked up a book from a table near the entrance, pretending to read the back cover while stealing glances at him. He had this way of being completely in the moment, and it was mesmerizing. "Find anything good?" he asked, catching me off guard. Maybe," I said, holding up the book without having a clue what it was about. He chuckled, and the sound made my chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. By the time we got back to his place, the sky had deepened to a rich blue, dotted with stars. We kicked off our shoes at the door, and he suggested watching a movie. His living room was just as inviting as the rest of his home, with its soft lighting and shelves filled with mementos from his life. I curled up on the couch while he rummaged through his collection of DVDs. Yes, DVDs. It was one of those quirks about him that I secretly adored. "How about something classic?" he asked, holding up a case. I nodded, trusting his taste completely. As the movie started, I found myself less interested in the plot, and more captivated by the feeling of being there with him. The weight of the week melted away, replaced by the warmth of the moment. At some point, he leaned back into the couch, his arm resting on the back, close enough that I could feel the faintest brush of his sleeve against my shoulder. I didn't move, I didn't want to. Halfway through the movie, I realized I hadn't been paying attention to the screen at all. My thoughts were too wrapped up in him, in the way he carried himself, in the quiet moments we shared that felt more meaningful than anything loud or grand. It was a kind of perfection I hadn't known before. I was searching until I found it when the credits rolled. Neither of us made the slightest move to get up. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the TV. I turned to him, ready to say something, anything, but he beat me to it. "Thanks for coming over," he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't realize how much I'd missed this. Me too, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. And in that moment it didn't feel like just another weekend anymore. It felt like the start of something I couldn't quite put into words, but I knew I didn't want it to end. However, when it was time to sleep, everything changed for me. The day had been wonderful, one of those rare perfect days where every moment felt easy and right. But lying in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The way John had smiled at me during our walk, the warmth in his voice as he talked about his favorite novels, the subtle brush of his arm against mine as we watched the movie. It all felt so vivid, as if it were still happening. And then it hit me, a realization so clear and undeniable that it took my breath away. I wasn't just crushing on John anymore. No, this wasn't some fleeting infatuation. I was falling for him deeply. The thought filled me with equal parts exhilaration and dread. What did it mean? What was I supposed to do with these feelings? It wasn't like I could just flirt it out. John was older, more experienced, and I couldn't help but wonder if he saw me as anything more than a close friend. Or worse, just a kid with a harmless little crush. The uncertainty was suffocating, yet thrilling in a way I couldn't quite explain. As I lay there, wide awake and lost in thought, I suddenly heard the soft creak of the bedroom door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I instinctively shut my eyes, pretending to be asleep. The room was dark, but I could sense his presence. I heard John moving quietly, the soft rustle of fabric and the faint scrape of a drawer being opened. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he could be doing. Was he looking for something? Did he think I was so deeply asleep that I wouldn't notice? My cheeks burned as a wave of self-consciousness washed over me. I stayed perfectly still, my breathing slow and steady, as if I were truly asleep. Whatever he was doing, it didn't last long. A minute or two later, I heard the door close softly, and then everything was silent again. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. What had just happened? Why had he come in? And why was my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst? There was something about the moment that felt strange, strangely intimate, even though nothing had really happened. It left me restless, my emotions churning in ways I didn't fully understand. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt almost intrusive after the strange, charged atmosphere of the night before. I tried to shake off the lingering feelings as I got ready for the day, but something didn't feel quite right. At first, it was just a vague sense that something was missing, but as I rifled through my overnight bag, the realization hit me. My lace panties were gone. I froze, staring at the contents of my bag, as if I'd simply overlooked them. But no matter how many times I checked, they weren't there. My mind reeled. It was such an absurd, almost laughable realization that I didn't know what to make of it. Had I left them somewhere? Was it possible I'd misplaced them? But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I knew they had been there when I packed. And then a new thought crept in, one that sent a flush of heat to my cheeks. Could John have taken them? The idea was absurd, and yet I couldn't entirely dismiss it. The timing, the way he had come into the bedroom last night while I pretended to be asleep, it all lined up in a way that made my stomach twist with a strange mix of emotions. Curiosity, embarrassment, excitement, and something else I couldn't quite name. What could I even say if I brought it up? Hey, did you by any chance? No, there was no way I could confront him about it without sounding ridiculous. And besides, what if I was wrong? What if it had all been just an innocent coincidence? I decided to let it go, at least for the time being. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation that I just hadn't thought of yet. Still, as we sat down for breakfast, I couldn't help but feel hyper-aware of his every movement, every glance. Was he acting differently? Did he know that I'd noticed? Or was I just imagining things? I wasn't sure if I should do anything about it, but I couldn't ignore the persistent feeling that something had changed. I knew something had changed between us, and there was no going back. That night, things got even stranger. We were in separate rooms, me in the guest room and John in his bedroom. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Then I heard it. Soft, strange noises coming from John's room. First, I told myself to ignore it. It wasn't my business and I didn't want to seem nosy. But the longer it went on, the more curious I became. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and walked to his door. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to knock or simply go back to bed. But before I could think better of it, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. John froze the moment he saw me. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, the lower part of his body naked. My panties were nearby. His face was a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. There was an intensity in his eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He said nothing. He just looked at me, his expression softening slightly. And then before I realized what I was doing, I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer to him. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and leave, but my heart had other plans. I stopped to step away from him, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then I kissed him. My hand moved downward, and I decided to help him continue. He shuddered with pleasure, and I liked it. It was impulsive, electric, and everything I didn't know I wanted. His lips were soft, warm, and the way he kissed me back sent a shiver down my spine. The world seemed to melt away, leaving just the two of us in that small room. I didn't think, didn't question, I just felt. We kissed for what felt like forever, our hands tangling in each other's hair, our breaths coming fast and shallow. But then reality hit me like a cold splash of water. I pulled back, my chest heaving, and looked at him with wide eyes. "This is a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. Without waiting for a response, I turned and practically fled the room, my cheeks burning. I hurried back to the guest room, closing the door behind me and leaning against it as if to keep the moment at bay. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. What had I just done? What did it mean? And how was I supposed to face him now? 5 minutes passed, then 10. I tried to steady my breathing, to push the memory of his lips, his touch, out of my mind. But it was impossible. My body still hummed with the memory of him, and I felt like I was on the verge of unraveling. And then there was a knock at my door. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't answer, unsure if I even could. But a moment later the door opened anyway, and there he was, John. He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. Before I could think, before I could tell him to leave or say something to break the tension, he crossed the room in 2 strides and kissed me again. This time I didn't resist. I couldn't. My breath caught. The building shimmered in the evening light, its glass facade reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. John stepped out of the car and came around to open my door, offering his hand to help me out. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I felt my cheeks flush as I took it. Inside, the hotel was even more stunning. The lobby was all marble and gold accents, with a grand chandelier casting a warm glow over everything. But I barely noticed any of it. My attention was on John, on the way he walked with such confidence, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back as he guided me toward the elevator. The ride up was silent, the tension between us almost unbearable. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the restraint in the way he stood so close but didn't touch me. When we reached the room, he slid the key card into the lock and pushed the door open, revealing a space that took my breath away. The room was luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Soft ambient lighting bathed everything in a golden glow, and there was a bottle of champagne chilling on the table, 2 glasses waiting beside it. But none of that mattered. The only thing I saw was him. He turned toward me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment we just stood there, the air between us crackling with anticipation. Then he stepped closer, his hands finding my waist, and kissed me. This kiss was different from the ones before, deeper, more urgent, as if he'd been holding back and couldn't any longer. My hands found their way to his shoulders, then to his hair, and I melted into him, letting everything else fall away. The rest of the night was pure fire. The way he kissed me, the way his hands moved over my skin, it was like we were in our own little world. Every touch, every whispered word, felt like it was setting me ablaze. The city lights outside glittered like 1,000 stars, but they were nothing compared to the way he made me feel. Time seemed to stand still as we lost ourselves in each other, and for those few hours nothing else mattered. When the night finally gave way to dawn, we lay tangled together in the massive bed, the early light streaming through the windows. I traced lazy patterns on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I didn't want the moment to end, didn't want to leave this bubble we'd created, but I knew that eventually reality would come knocking. For now, though, I let myself stay in the moment, savoring every second with him, every beat of my heart that echoed his name. The next morning I woke up before him. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a golden light across the room. John was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He looked so peaceful, and for a moment I just watched him, feeling a warmth in my chest that I wasn't ready to name. The kitchen was well-stocked but unfamiliar, so I improvised, gathering ingredients for something simple but comforting. Eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and coffee. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt right. As the aroma of sizzling butter filled the air, I found myself humming a tune, a habit I'd picked up whenever I was happy. By the time everything was ready, I couldn't wait to see his reaction. Carrying the tray back to the bedroom, I set it down on the nightstand and leaned over to gently nudge him awake. "John," I whispered, my voice soft but insistent. His eyes fluttered open, and he gave me one of those sleepy smiles that melted me all over again. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. His gaze shifted to the tray, and his smile widened. "Breakfast looks amazing," he said, pulling me close by the waist. "But the real main dish is you." I laughed, swatting playfully at his shoulder, but my heart was racing. His words, his touch, the way he looked at me, it all felt so natural, so effortless. We ate together, sitting cross-legged on the bed, sharing bites and stealing kisses between sips of coffee. The food was simple, but the moment was perfect. Every laugh, every shared glance, felt like it was knitting us closer, weaving a bond that was growing stronger with each passing second. After breakfast, we stayed in bed, wrapped up in each other. The hours slipped by unnoticed as we talked, laughed, and kissed. He told me stories about his childhood, the places he had been, and the people he had met, and I hung on every word. There was something about him that fascinated me, layers I wanted to uncover and understand. In turn, I shared pieces of myself, things I hadn't planned on revealing, but I felt safe telling him. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine, and for the first time in a long time I felt truly seen. The intimacy of the morning wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. There was a vulnerability in the way we opened up to each other, a tacit agreement to lower our defenses. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I had always been cautious with my heart, but with John, it was as if all my defenses had crumbled without me even realizing it. As the morning stretched into early afternoon, the sunlight streaming through the windows grew brighter, casting long golden beams across the room. John reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice low but steady, "but I don't want it to end." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I nodded, unable to find the right words to respond, but he seemed to understand. He pulled me close and we stayed like that for a while, our hearts beating in unison. Felt right, in a way I couldn't explain, as if we were exactly where we were meant to be. Looking back, everything about John felt like a whirlwind. Intense, thrilling, and impossible to ignore. He was unlike anyone I had ever known, and being with him was like stepping into a world I hadn't known existed. It wasn't what I expected, and I didn't know where it was going, but for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid of the unknown. For now I was all in, ready to see where this path would lead, even if it meant risking my heart, because with John it felt like a risk worth taking.